The county would talk of that ball for 30 years, and in all the tellings and retellings, in card rooms and kitchens, and once, memorably from a pulpit, no two accounts ever agreed on the music, the month, or the number of candles, but every account without exception preserved the same 11 words, because they were the whole matter, and the county knew it. Fetch her fan. That was the first part, 3 words, spoken by Julian Ash, Duke of Wrexham, in his own ballroom, before the first set of the evening had formed, to his own wife. And she brought it, and her cloak with it. That was the second part, and it took rather longer than the first, perhaps 4 minutes by the ballroom clock, and those 4 minutes are the reason the story survived 30 years. Because in the length of them a room containing 140 people learned to hold its breath. It was the last night of October, and Wrexham Abbey was lit as it was lit once a year, every sconce, every lustre, the long gallery, a river of candlelight. And the Duke stood at the head of his own ballroom with Lady Sylvia Marchmont at his side. And if you had asked any person present who the evening belonged to, they would have glanced at the Duchess of Wrexham, standing a little apart in grey silk, and then at Lady Sylvia in bronze, glittering, laughing, her hand already half raised toward the forming set, and they would have given you the honest, uncomfortable answer. Lady Sylvia had left her fan in the supper-room. She discovered the loss the way such women discover such things, audibly, prettily, with a little turn of the wrist to show the hand's emptiness, and the Duke of Wrexham, wishing before 140 witnesses to be of service to her, did not signal a footman, of whom 11 stood in that room in his own livery, trained from boyhood to exactly this purpose. He turned instead to the woman in grey silk, and in the flat, unhurried voice of a man asking nothing out of the ordinary, he said, "Fetch her fan." There are insults that roar, and the county had weathered plenty of those, dukes being dukes, and there are insults that whisper, and the whispering kind are the ones that change what a room is. No one gasped. That must be understood. What happened was quieter and much worse, a kind of stillness that began at the Duke's elbow and spread outward ring by ring, the way frost takes a window, as 140 people arrived, each at their own speed, at the same understanding that the Duke of Wrexham had just sent his wife on a servant's errand for his favourite's convenience in front of the Shire. The musicians, who could see the floor, let the opening chords die unplayed. And the Duchess of Wrexham looked at her husband for a moment that the vicar's wife, who stood nearest, described ever afterward as the longest short moment of her life, and then she inclined her head, precisely, the depth of an order acknowledged, and turned and went, unhurried, down the whole lit length of that gallery alone, with every eye in the county on her back, and her back gave them nothing at all. She was gone 4 minutes. It is worth dwelling on what a ballroom does with 4 minutes it cannot fill. The Duke attempted conversation, and found Lady Sylvia's answering laughter suddenly loud in his ear, a sound with nothing under it. Somewhere in the crowd her own people, for the Duchess had her own people in that room, though the Duke had never counted them, the tenants' wives invited by custom, old Strud the steward in his good black coat, stood with their faces closed like doors. And then she came back. She came back carrying the fan, bronze silk to match its owner's dress, carrying it correctly, lightly, as a thing of no weight, and over her other arm folded her travelling cloak, and the room saw the cloak before the Duke did, and understood it before the Duke did, and the stillness changed key. She crossed to Lady Sylvia and presented the fan with a curtsy of faultless depth, the curtsy owed by a duchess to a marchioness's widow not 1 inch lower. And Lady Sylvia took her own fan with the first uncertain expression she had worn that year. Then the Duchess of Wrexham turned to her husband, and here every telling for 30 years slows down. Because here the county kept hoping, in version after version, that she had said something fine and terrible to carry away and repeat, and she never had. She looked at him, the way she might have looked at a column of figures that would not sum and was no longer her concern, and she shook out the cloak and put it on. Her own hands, no maid, fastening the clasp at her throat with perfect steadiness in front of 140 people, and she walked out of the ballroom by the great doors, which a footman, may his name be remembered, one of the 11 who had not been sent for the fan, leapt to open for her with a bow he made as deep as he dared. The doors closed. The music eventually began, and the Duke of Wrexham danced the first set of the last ball he ever gave, with Lady Sylvia Marchmont's restored fan moving between them like a small bronze ghost, and made a fair show of it. The county granted him that much. And before the supper interval, Lady Sylvia had laid the fan down on a chair rail somewhere and forgotten it, because it had never been the fan she wanted fetched, and at dawn, when the carriages were gone and the candles were being pinched out room by room, the Duke of Wrexham walked the gallery alone and found it lying there, abandoned, a scrap of bronze, silk and ivory sticks not worth a footman's stooping. The entire price of what he had spent his wife to buy, and he picked it up, and he did not put it down again. And it lay on his desk from that morning onward, where his letters were, where his eyes were, for reasons he would take a full year to be able to say aloud. If you have ever been made a servant in a room you were meant to be mistress of, if you have ever been handed an errand in a voice that told everyone present exactly what your place was worth, in a meeting, at a family table, at a gathering where you had every right to stand and were sent to fetch instead, then you know already why the Duchess of Wrexham fastened her own cloak that night, and you know what it cost her to do it steadily, and this story is yours as much as hers, so stay with it. Because how a woman walks out of a room like that, and what becomes of the man who emptied it, is the whole of what follows. And if stories where dignity outlasts cruelty are the stories you keep, consider subscribing. And tell us in the comments what country you are watching from, for this particular ache is spoken in every language there is. She did not take a carriage. The stable yard would have harnessed for her in 10 minutes, and half the county said afterward that she should have made them do it, gone down the front steps behind matched greys with the lamps lit, but she was a steward's daughter before she was a duchess, and she knew the distances of that estate the way other women know the rooms of their own houses, and the frost was hard, and the moon was up. And the walk to her father's cottage by the orchard path was 1 mile and a quarter, and she had walked it in worse. So the last the ballroom's windows saw of the Duchess of Wrexham was a grey figure in a dark cloak, going down the terrace steps and out across the silvered grass, at an even pace, alone, and the frost taking her footprints one by one behind her. What she felt on that walk she never told a living soul. But the orchard path goes through the young plantation she had grafted herself 3 springs before. Whips of apple and pear tied to their stakes, her own knife-work knitted and growing in the dark on either side of her. And at the gate in the plantation fence she stopped, one gloved hand on the rail, and stood for the space of several breaths looking back at the abbey, every window gold, the music just audible where the air lay still, the whole warm, enormous world that had sent her for a fan, and her shoulders came down once, slowly, the way a branch gives up its snow. And that was all, and no one saw it, and we will not make more of it than she did. Her father's cottage stood past the walled garden, the steward's house of the old Duke's time, kept for Hartley in his illness, by an arrangement she herself had written into the estate books, and there was a light in it. For Thomas Hartley kept old man's hours, sleeping at dusk and waking in the dark, and when his daughter came in with the cold shining off her cloak, he looked at her from his chair by the fire for a long moment. Her evening dress under the travelling cloak, her dancing slippers dark with frost, and being her father and a steward 40 years, a man whose whole life had been reading the state of things from small wrong details, he asked her no question at all. He said only that the kettle was not long off the fire, and that her old room was aired, for it was always aired, and she sat down across from him and drank tea in her ball dress while her slippers dried on the fender. And they talked, if they talked at all, about the frost, and whether it would hold and what it would do to the late pears. And that night the Duchess of Wrexham slept in the narrow bed she had slept in at 14, under the same slope of ceiling, and the great house on the hill blazed on without her until the last carriage rolled away and left it, as she could have told them it would be. Dark. The county expected her back within the week. That must be recorded, because it measures how little the county understood what it had witnessed. A scene, they reasoned, a tiff, a lesson handsomely administered, and then the machinery of rank would draw her home. For where else does a duchess go, and what else does a duchess do? They did not know that on the second morning she had put on her plain brown wool and walked to the estate office as she had done 6 days a week for 7 years, not to resume her place but to close it out. And there, with old Strood standing by with his face working, she had spent 4 hours setting the books of Wrexham in an order so complete, so annotated, so patiently cross-referenced for the understanding of whoever came after her, that Strood said afterward it was like watching a woman lay out her own effects. The planting lists for spring were fair copied. The tenant's arrears, with her private notes on which were misfortune and which were habit, were folded into the rent book. The orchard calendar, the whole living year of the estate that existed nowhere but in her head, she wrote out from memory onto 12 sheets, grafting to gathering, and pinned them in order, and on the last sheet, where a stranger would look for a signature, she wrote only. The trees will tell you most of this themselves if you attend to them. And then she squared the piles, and gave Strood the office key, the same gesture with which she had been given it 7 years before, and shook his old hand, which finished him entirely, and walked back down the orchard path, and was, in every sense the estate's books could measure, gone. What she left behind her, though neither she nor anyone else yet framed it so, was an experiment no one had ever thought to run. The great house and the whole demesne of Wrexham, for the first time in 7 years, operating exactly as its master believed it had always operated, which is to say, without her. To understand the 4 minutes that emptied a ballroom, you must go back a long way, further back than the marriage, back to a summer when Julian Ash was 20 and the world had not yet taught him its one lesson. He was the old Duke's second son then, the spare, the open-faced one, and he fell in love that summer the way second sons are permitted to, entirely, artlessly, keeping nothing in reserve. with the Honourable Sylvia Dane, 17, the loveliest girl in 3 counties and perfectly aware of it, and she let him love her for a season and a half, took his letters, wore his flowers, let the county assume what it liked, and then in the spring the Marquess of Harwood came north, a widower of 51 with 40,000 a year, and Sylvia Dane became Lady Sylvia Marchmont in a wedding the papers called brilliant. And to Julian, on the last morning, in the shrubbery walk where he had said everything a boy can say, she offered by way of explanation 1 sentence only, delivered kindly, which made it worse. You have a heart, Julian, but hearts are not settlements. He was 20. His brother died of a fall 2 years later and made him the heir, and his father's long decline made him master in all but name by 26, and somewhere in those years the open-faced boy completed the only construction project he ever oversaw personally, which was the sealing of himself. The county, watching the new Duke of Wrexham refuse every lure thrown at him through his 20s, called it pride or grief or coldness of nature, and it was none of those things, it was policy. The policy of a man who had concluded from the evidence that what he had offered at 20 had been worthless currency, and that he would not be caught trading in it again. Hearts are not settlements. Very well. He would deal thenceforward in settlements. And this is where Eleanor Hartley enters, though in truth she had been there all along, which is the whole point of her, the steward's daughter, 2 years his junior, raised in the cottage past the walled garden. A child of the estate the way the Oaks were, present in the corner of every summer of his boyhood. The grave little girl, who knew where the kingfishers nested and which gate sagged, grown into the quiet young woman who, when her father's hands began to fail, simply and without any announcement became her father's hands. So that for years the old Duke was served by a steward called Hartley, who was in increasing proportion a girl in a brown dress with ink on her fingers. Julian knew her the way a man knows a load-bearing wall, which is to say not at all, until it is touched. When the old Duke died and the full weight of Wrexham came on to Julian's shoulders, and old Hartley took to his chair by the fire for good, the new Duke spent 1 week attempting to comprehend the estate's workings from its books, and then rode down the orchard path to the steward's cottage to ask in effect how any of it worked. And Eleanor Hartley stood in her father's office among her father's ledgers, which were her ledgers, and told him for 3 hours without notes, and at the end of it Julian Ash, who dealt in settlements, made the most sensible transaction of his life for the worst possible reasons. It was not baldly put. There were forms. There was a courtship of a sort conducted over rent rolls and drainage maps, but the sum of it was never in doubt on his side. Wrexham needed what she carried in her head. Her father's line had served his for 3 generations. She was sensible, she was steady, she would do. And a coronet against a lifetime's competence struck him as a fair exchange, hearts nowhere in the instrument. What he did not know, because he had sealed himself too early to be able to read such things, was that the grave little girl who knew where the kingfishers nested had loved him since she was 9 years old. Silently, hopelessly, in the complete privacy of a child who understood her station, and then of a woman who understood it better. And that when the Duke of Wrexham asked for her hand across her father's rent table, believing himself to be hiring at a fair rate the services of an estate, he was in fact being handed the whole treasury of a heart that had been kept for him, unspent for 20 years, and he never counted it, because it was currency he had stopped dealing in, and she never told him the sum. Because she had her pride, and her pride was of the durable kind, the kind that does not perform. She married him in the abbey chapel in a plain dress, with her father weeping happily and unsteadily on a chair at the front, and she wore, because he had sent flowers as the forms required, a posy of orchard blossom that she had in fact chosen herself when the hothouse offerings came wrong, and pressed afterward, one spray of it, flat in her mother's prayer book, where it stayed. That was the whole of her trousseau of hopes, one pressed spray of apple blossom, and she was too honest a bookkeeper to enter it anywhere but in the most private of accounts. But she entered it, and for 7 years, while she ran his house and his land and warmed his tenants' loyalty and balanced his books, that entry sat quietly on the page, accruing its small hidden interest, waiting, in the patient way of things pressed in prayer books, for a season that might never come, and had nearly, very nearly, begun to come, which is what made the fan, when it came instead, not a rudeness, but a ruin. For the season had, nearly, begun to come. This must be set down with care, because it is what the county never knew, and it is the difference between a sad story and this one. In the 7th year of that settled, silent working marriage, the Duke of Wrexham had begun, by degrees so small that only a woman keeping private accounts would have entered them, to thaw. He had taken to saying we shall try the new grafts in the long orchard. We are not inclined to sell the timber. It is a small word, and she priced it cautiously, and entered it. He had begun to walk the pear walk in the evenings, at the hour she cut the late roses, not with her, nothing so declared, but within sight, at a parallel distance that shortened by a few yards each month, the way a wild thing closes with a lighted window in hard weather. In March, without being asked, without mentioning it afterward, he had ordered her grey mare shod and rugged early, because the farrier's boy let slip that her grace meant to ride the far tenancies before the roads dried, and when she opened the estate diary and found the order entered in his own hand, she sat looking at that page, Strood reported long afterward, for a good while, and once, seeking a lease in his desk, she had found her own planting lists, the working scraps she wrote for the gardeners and thought thrown away, a year and more of them, kept flat in a drawer with the estate's permanent papers, her handwriting filed among the deeds. And she had closed the drawer very quietly, as one closes the door of a room where something is sleeping, and carried that discovery around with her for weeks like a coal carried in cupped hands through wind, warming, dangerous, not yet afire. That was the state of the account when Lady Sylvia Marchmont came home. The Marquess of Harwood had died as considerately as he had lived, leaving her young enough at 34, rich enough, and bored enough to be a public danger. And she returned to her family's seat 8 miles from Wrexham, trailing London behind her like scent, and the county, which forgets nothing, leaned forward as one body to watch. What she wanted of Julian Ash, it is fairest to say she herself perhaps never fully audited, some compound of old property reclaimed, of a mirror in which she was still 17, of simple sport in a dull county. But what she did was methodical enough for any purpose. She was at every dinner. She had a way of arriving at the Abbey on small pretexts in the blue hour when a house looks its most golden. She spoke to the Duke always and only in the private language of that 20-year-old summer, the shrubbery jokes, the dead Marcus gently mocked, the sentence begun with "Do you remember?" and the sealed man, who had built his whole fortress against precisely this siege, discovered what such men always discover, that the fortress had been built to keep out armies, and she had simply walked in through the door he had never once thought to lock, the one marked before. To his wife, Lady Sylvia was faultless, which was the cruelest instrument in her case, a warm, laughing, glancing courtesy, admiring the gardens, deferring prettily on questions of the household, and all of it pitched, with a marksman's eye, half an inch above the head of a steward's daughter, so that no single sentence could ever be carried away as evidence. And the sum of every sentence was, my dear, we both know what you are. And Eleanor, who could price anything, priced her exactly and said nothing, because what she was watching for was not Lady Sylvia's game, but her husband's answer to it, and through that summer and autumn she watched the wee dry out of his mouth, and the parallel evening walks stop, and the man who had been closing with the lighted window turn and go back out into the weather he trusted. And still she hoped, cautiously, at reduced valuation, because the mare had been shod and the lists were in the drawer, and a woman who has kept an account for 20 years does not write it off for one bad season. The ball was to be the proof, one way or the other, though she never framed it so aloud. His ball, his house, her arrangement of it, the county assembled, and somewhere in the pit of the evening the question would answer itself. Whose side of the room does he stand on? It answered itself before the first set. Fetch her fan. 4 words? No, 3. She corrected herself even then, some bookkeeping part of her correcting the count even as the room went still. 3 words. And the account of 20 years closed in the time they took to say. Because here is what the county, retelling its 30 years of versions, mostly missed. The fan was nothing. The errand was nothing. Footmen exist, wives oblige. A fan may be fetched between friends and mean less than nothing. It was not the errand. It was that he issued it without looking at her. He gave the order into the air between himself and Lady Sylvia, attention wholly on his guest, wife dispatched with the mere unconsidered edge of his voice, and in that half-second Eleanor Hartley received, at last, the settled answer to the question she had been holding open since she was 9 years old, which was, when he does not think. When there is no policy and no fortress and no performance, what am I to him? And the answer, delivered before 140 witnesses, was, staff not hated. Nothing so warm. Simply staff, and so she went for the fan, because a good steward completes the office's business before resigning the office, and she came back with her cloak, because the resignation was already written. It had written itself somewhere on the stairs down to the supper room, in the same fair round hand as all her work, and the pressed blossom in the prayer book, which is the only witness to what that walk down the gallery cost her, went north in the cottage trunk 2 days later, still flat, still kept. For she was not a woman who burned things in fits of feeling, but moved now to the very back of the book, behind the Psalms, where accounts are kept that no longer bear interest. The abbey did not fall down. Great houses never do. At first they merely begin quietly to run on the fat of the order the departed hand has left behind, and for a month the Duke of Wrexham was able to believe that nothing material had changed, that the household silence was tact, that the estate turned as it had always turned, and this was because Eleanor had left the machine wound. The planting lists were fair copied, the rent book annotated, the 12 sheets of the orchard calendar pinned in order in the office, and It was November, when the land asks little. It was in the new year that the questions began which the sheets could not answer, because no document holds what a mind holds. The Ramby lease came up for renewal, and Strood, asked for the history of it, said that Her Grace had it, meaning had it in her head, the whole tangled 40-year story of the Rambys, which mattered, because the lease as written would ruin them, and she had always adjusted it by a private understanding renewed each Lady Day with a handshake. The question of the South Orchard drainage arose, and was found to exist nowhere on paper at all, except in a line on the 9th sheet, "Attend to the culvert before Easter," with no word of where the culvert was. The great house's own weather changed. Cook gave notice, and withdrew it twice. The maids cried oftener than the Duke thought maids cried, and through that winter Julian Ashe conducted his days correctly, dined correctly, answered his letters correctly, and found himself at unpredictable hours in rooms he had not intended to enter. The estate office, where a hand he knew ran up every page, the pair walk in the frost at the hour the late roses had used to be cut, and nightly at his own desk, where a bronze silk fan lay across the corner of the blotter, and he did not move it, and he could not have told you why, and the one time a housemaid lifted it to dust beneath, he spoke to her with a sharpness he spent the rest of the day being privately ashamed of. He read the orchard calendar the way another man might read letters, because that is what they were. 12 sheets in her round fair hand, the whole living year of Wrexham set down as a gift for whoever came after her, and no man reads far in a document like that without meeting its author. The patience in it, the 20 years of attention in it, the line about the trees telling you most of it themselves if you attend to them. And he sat with that line one February evening for above an hour, because he had begun, at last and far too late, to attend. And what the trees and the sheets and the ledgers and the pear walk all told him in one voice was the same thing. You were given a heart of the first water for 7 years, entered in your books as staff, and you sent it to fetch a fan. Meanwhile, a mile and a quarter down the orchard path, the object of all this documentary grief was conducting the least tragic winter of anyone in this story. Eleanor Hartley, for she used her father's name now in matters of business, had been approached in December by Squire Bellamy, whose lands marched with Wrexham's western edge, and whose orchards were a byword for 40 years of neglect. And the squire, a shrewd, kindly, entirely unembarrassable man who cared for cider and not at all for county drama, had offered her terms, proper terms, drawn and signed, to survey and remake his fruit grounds, and she had accepted. And all that winter the county was treated to the sight, once unthinkable, of the Duchess of Wrexham in a brown wool habit, walking another man's orchard rows with a knife at her belt, marking trees for the axe and the graft, directing a crew of Bellamy's men who within a fortnight would have walked into the river for her, and being paid on quarter days a fee she had set herself, and the squire paid without blinking, telling anyone who asked that he had got the best land-mind in the north for the price of a hunter. She lodged with her father. She kept his fire, and his accounts, and his spirits, and old Hartley, watching his daughter come in ruddy from the frost with sawdust on her cuffs, held his tongue with the discipline of 40 years' service, and said only once at Christmas, into the fire, that he had worked all his life for the Abbey, and the Abbey had been worth it, mostly, and that she was worth 10 of it, and that he was proud of her, and that finished her composure for the evening. the only thing that winter that did. And here it is honest to record what the county's wisest heads, its old women, said among themselves that winter, which was that her grace looked 5 years younger, and that this was the worst possible sign for his grace. Because a wronged wife who pines can be fetched home with one handsome gesture, but a wronged wife who flourishes has learned the one fact fatal to all handsome gestures, that the air is breathable on the far side of the wall. It was the aunt who arrived first, as aunts do. Lady Constance Ashe, the old Duke's sister, 74, deaf exactly when she chose to be, descended upon the Abbey in February, and at the end of her second dinner, opposite her great-nephew's correctness, she set down her glass and delivered herself, unasked, of the family audit. "I am told," she said, "that you mislaid your wife at a ball. I am told further, and this is the part I came to verify, that you have not gone the 1.25 miles to get her back. In 14 weeks, a distance I have seen you ride for a fox in under 3 minutes. You are afraid of a cottage, Julian. Your grandfather feared the French, and your father feared nothing, and you have brought us to fearing a steward's cottage with roses over the door." And when he attempted his flat voice on her, the voice that closed subjects, she looked at him over her glass with the family's own grey eyes gone terrible, and said the sentence that stripped him, my dear boy. "You are not cold. You have never been cold. You are the warmest of the whole silly line and the most frightened. You loved once at 20 like a house afire and were laughed at for it. And you have spent 20 years making sure no one could ever laugh at you again. And you have succeeded. No one is laughing. Your house is empty. Your table is silent. Your wife is grafting another man's pears. Nobody laughs here at all now, and I hope it is everything you planned." But it was the boy who turned the key. Thomas, 9 years old, the orphaned son of the Duke's dead cousin and ward of the house, a personage who went where he pleased on the strength of nobody's having decided otherwise, had spent that winter conducting his own investigation with the patient unfairness of children. And one evening in March he stationed himself at the corner of the great desk, regarded the bronze fan for some time, and said, "That is Lady Sylvia's fan. She left it. I saw." And then, having established the record, he asked his question. "There were footmen at the ball," he said. "I counted them from the stairs. There were 11. Footmen fetch fans. That is what they are for. Roberts fetches mine when I drop it, and I am 9. Why did you make Aunt Eleanor do it?" And the Duke of Wrexham, who had survived his aunt, looked at a 9-year-old's level eyes, and did not survive them, and answered him with the first fully honest sentence he had spoken aloud in 20 years. "I made her do it because I was showing off to someone I was frightened of, and it was the worst thing I have ever done." And Thomas considered this with judicial gravity, and replied, "Then you should say that to Aunt Eleanor, and mind you say the frightened part, that is the part she doesn't know." And history does not record which of the two of them was more surprised by the quality of the child's advice, but it records that the Duke wrote to no one that night, ordered no gesture, and instead began the following morning to do something he had never in his life done for anyone, which was to prepare himself to be laughed at. It is time to be fair to Lady Sylvia Marchmont, briefly, because the record allows it. Through that same winter she had continued her visits to the Abbey, and found them, month by month, less amusing, for the game she had come north to play required a board, and the board had walked out of the ballroom in a grey cloak and taken the game's whole meaning with her. There is no sport in winning a man from nobody. Still she persisted, out of habit and because retreat was not in her repertoire, and in March she overreached, as such campaigners always do, arriving at the Abbey with a London upholsterer's man in tow and a book of silks under her arm, and conducting him into the morning room, the Duchess's morning room. With remarks upon what the room might become once it was relieved of its present scheme, and she was standing in the middle of that room, directing the man's measuring tape with one gloved finger, when she became aware that the Duke of Wrexham was standing in the doorway watching her, and that his face had in it something she had never once seen in 20 years of managing him, which was clarity. He looked at her for a long moment, at the silks, at the tape stretched across another woman's room, and what he saw at last was not the girl of the shrubbery walk. That girl had been gone for years. If she had ever existed outside his own boyish authorship of her. What he saw was a handsome, restless, expensive woman measuring his wife's morning room for silk. A woman who had sold him at 20 for 40,000 a year and had come back, the capital spent, to see whether the goods might be had now at no cost at all, and he said, in a voice she did not recognize either, that the room was not to be altered, that no room in that house was to be altered, that the house was as its mistress had left it, and would remain so against her convenience, whenever that convenience should be consulted, which he intended it should be. There was a silence worthy of the ballroom itself, and the upholsterer's man, a Londoner of experience, began rolling up his tape with the speed of a sailor reefing before weather, and Lady Sylvia, to her credit, and it is nearly her only credit in this account, but let her have it whole, did not tack or laugh it away, or attempt the shrubbery voice. She drew on her glove and looked at him with the first honest expression she had shown north of London, something between rue and a kind of professional respect, one gamester acknowledging the table's turn, and she said, "Ah," and then, gathering her book of silks, she delivered the sentence that she had, perhaps, been sent north by Providence expressly to deliver, and which he deserved, and needed, and never forgot. "Do you know, Julian, I refused you once because hearts are not settlements, and I have believed it all my life, and it has answered for me about as well as your believing it has answered for you. You married the only person in this county who ever loved you for nothing, the only one I have looked, and you sent her across a ballroom on my errands. We are the same kind of foal, you and I, only she paid your debts for 7 years first, and nobody living has ever paid mine. Send my compliments to your Duchess, if she will have them." And she went back to London at Easter, married a banker within the 2 years, a clever, patient man who is said to manage her beautifully, and passes out of this story as she passed through every room in her life, glittering, unaccompanied by any lasting damage she could not herself repair, and leaving behind her, on the whole, more instruction than harm. The public test came in April, at the spring assembly at the county town, the first great gathering since the ball, and the Duke of Wrexham went to it knowing what he would meet. Because the fan story had wintered well, as such stories do, growing a fine coat of embellishments, and there was a particular set in the county, led by a florid, mortgage-ridden baronet called Sir Hector Vane Loftus, that had decided the whole affair was the best joke of the age. The Duchess playing footman, the Cloak, the walk home across the grass, and at the assembly supper, warm with claret, Sir Hector could not resist it, and rose, glass in hand, to be witty. He hoped, he said, beaming down the long table, that his grace had come provided this evening. For if any lady should mislay her fan, there was no knowing whom he might dispatch for it. And the ladies would all be leaving their fans about on purpose now in hopes of a ducal errand, and much more in the same vein. And the table laughed. Not all of it, but enough. And there it was again. The room, the witnesses, the choice, and every soul at that supper who had been at the October ball stopped breathing to see what the Duke would do with it, because they had seen him buy his comfort once at his wife's expense and had no reason on earth to expect anything different now. He stood. He waited for the laughter to find its own end, unhurried, and those nearest said afterward that he looked in that moment curiously light, like a man setting down luggage. And then he said that Sir Hector was quite right, and that he was glad the matter had been raised at a full table, because he had an account to correct and had been waiting for witnesses enough to correct it properly, the original error having been committed before 140. What happened at my ball, he said plainly into the quiet, was this. I ordered my wife before the county to run a servant's errand for a guest, to flatter that guest. Because I was vain of her notice and afraid of her opinion, and my wife obeyed me exactly, brought the fan, curtsied where a curtsy was owed, and left my house rather than remain in it as staff, and she was right to go, and the shame of that evening is mine alone. Entire. Without remainder. And any man or woman here who has been enjoying the story these 5 months has been laughing, I now inform them, at me, which they are welcome to continue doing, for the matter deserves laughter, only let them get the object of it right. As for the lady they laugh at, he said, taking up his glass, you may find her work at Squire Billamy's, where fruit grounds 40 years derelict will bear this autumn, because she walked them all winter with a knife at her belt, as she carried the whole of Wrexham in her head for 7 years, while I got the credit of it at suppers such as this. And there is not a man in this room fit to fetch and carry for her, its host least of all, and I give you, since I am on my feet and hold a glass, the health of the Duchess of Wrexham, my wife, the best steward, the best landlord, and the best woman in this county, whom I sent for a fan. And he drank, alone at first, and then not alone, for old Bellamy came up out of his chair with his glass high, roaring the toast like a man at a harvest home, and after Bellamy the table had no choice, and Sir Hector Vane Loftus drank it too, sitting down, into a silence of his own manufacture, and the county carried that speech home in its pockets, and has it yet. And it reached Beckside Cottage, of course, by 2 routes before Sunday, the way everything did, and Eleanor heard it out to the end, said nothing, and went back, the account books say, to pricing Bellamy's cider casks, but Strood, who had told her the fullest version, reported to his wife one detail the other routes missed, that at the words, "The shame is mine alone," entire, without remainder, her Grace had stopped writing, and had sat quite still for the length of a breath with her pen off the paper, and then had gone on pricing casks, and that he, Strood, had served the Abbey man and boy for 50 years, and knew a spring thaw when he stood in one. He came to the cottage in the first week of May, and he came on foot down the orchard path she had walked in October, which was not lost on her, and he came carrying nothing, no flowers, no jewel case, no instrument of handsome gesture, because his aunt had told him, in the one piece of tactical advice he accepted that spring, that if he brought that woman so much as a nosegay, she would price it to the shilling and hand him back the change. Old Hartley received him at the door with the perfect unsurprise of a man who had watched the path from his window for half a year, and showed him into the little parlour where the Duchess of Wrexham sat at a plain table with Bellamy's ledgers open before her. And then the old steward performed the last great office of his service, which was to say that he would be in the garden minding the bees, and to go there and mind them for above an hour in a coat too thin for the day. She did not rise. She indicated the second chair, the visitor's chair, and he sat where he was put, and what he said then he had built the way she built an orchard, slowly, from the roots, over months, and it is set down here nearly whole, because the county never heard it, and it was the best thing he ever made. He said he had not come to ask her home, and she would understand why before he finished. He said that he had spent the winter learning what she was, from the books, from the sheets, from Strood, from the trees themselves, and that this was itself part of the shame, that a man should have to learn from documents what had stood at his own table for 7 years. He said that the errand at the ball had not been carelessness, and she was not to extend him that mercy, for he had examined it, and it did not hold. It had been a purchase. He had spent her standing, her dignity, and 20 years of her keeping, to buy one approving glance from a woman he had been afraid of since he was 20 years old. And the purchase had shamed him within the hour, and the goods had been left on a chair rail before midnight. And he had kept the fan on his desk half a year, not from sentiment, but as a bill unpaid, the exact price of what he was when no one governed him. He said that his aunt had called him the most frightened of his line, and that this was accurate, and that he had been frightened of precisely one thing since his 20th year, of offering a heart and having it priced, and that in guarding against that one humiliation he had committed a worse one, hourly, for 7 years, against the only person who had never once priced him. And he knew now what she had brought to their marriage and where it was pressed, for her father, questioned ruthlessly, had broken under the combined assault of the Duke and the boy Thomas, and told them about the prayer book. And at this single point in the interview, her chin came up, and her eyes went dangerous. And he did not retreat. He said, "You kept apple blossom from a posy you chose yourself because the hothouse sent wrong. And you kept it 7 years while I filed your handwriting with the deeds and could not have told you the colour of your eyes in a lit room. And if we are pricing hearts at last, madam, then mine has been the counterfeit in the house, not yours. And I am come to say so, and to say the frightened part aloud, because I am instructed by a 9-year-old that it is the part you do not know." Then he stopped and asked for nothing, and the little parlour was quiet, with the bees working the currant flowers outside the window, and her father visible beyond them, resolutely minding what needed no minding, and Eleanor Ashe, Duchess of Wrexham, closed Bellamy's ledger, and looked at her husband across it for a long moment, and rendered her decision as she rendered every account item by item in a level voice without one tear, and it is the speech the women of that family have handed down to their daughters since, in kitchens and at weddings, more carefully than any jewel. She said that she believed him, and that belief was not restoration, and he would attend to the difference. She said she would not return to a house where her place must ever again depend on the hour's company, and therefore her terms were these: that her place be defended when it cost him, or the defence was theatre, and she named the measure precisely, not at assemblies, with the county watching and a speech prepared, but on the ordinary Tuesday, in the small room against the small sneer, from his mother's portraits if need be, ordinarily, perpetually as a matter of course, as one keeps a roof mended, without applause. That she would keep Bellamy's orchards, and her fee, and her father's name in matters of business, for her work was hers. It had been the one thing in her life that never depended on being loved, and she would not surrender it again to any weather of any man's heart. That the fan was to stay on his desk. This clause she delivered without explanation, and he accepted without asking for one. Though he understood it well enough, she was leaving the bill where she could audit it. And that if all of this was performed, not promised, through the summer, through ordinary post and ordinary Tuesdays, with no gestures, no fetching of her, for she had been fetched at quite enough speed for one lifetime, then at the apple harvest, when Bellamy's contract closed. She would look at the whole account again, and render what it honestly came to, and not one day sooner. He rose and thanked her, and asked no abatement, and at the door he paused and said, "Not as a plea, but as a report, the pear walk wants you. I have kept your hours in it all winter, and the roses are ahead of me." And then he walked home, up the orchard path. And she watched him out of sight from her father's window, and old Hartley came in from the bees frozen half through and entirely satisfied, and neither father nor daughter said one word about any of it, which was their way, and both slept well, which tells the rest. The summer that followed was outwardly nothing, which was its whole design. The estate's letters went down the path as business required, her directions sought, if convenient, her fees paid at the rate she set, unrounded. Thomas came on Saturdays officially for the bees, actually for her, and was fed, and taught grafting, and carried home, without knowing himself, a courier, the small news of the cottage that kept the Duke going from Tuesday to Tuesday. And the Tuesdays themselves accumulated, quietly, in the county sight. The vicar's wife corrected at her own tea-table, gently, completely. When she ventured that her grace had perhaps been a little dramatic in October, the land agent from Ripon, who spoke slightingly of lady stewards, shone to the door with his business unconcluded. The great blazing ball at the Abbey cancelled that autumn, and in its place, to the county's astonishment, the harvest supper moved up from the tenant's barn into the long gallery itself, her people, her tables, her recipes, under the sconces where she had been sent for the fan. And the Duke of Wrexham stood at the head of it, and gave one toast only. The health of those who keep things alive, whether or not anyone thanks them, and every tenant in the gallery knew who was toasted, and drank it looking at the empty chair he had caused to be set, unremarked, at his right hand. She came at the apple harvest, as she had said, when Bellamy's contract closed with the squire's cider, fetching a price that made him weep with joy into his own vats. And she rendered the account as promised, and the rendering took place where it had begun, not in the Abbey, but in the long orchard, where he was found, on the appointed morning, in his shirt-sleeves, ineptly and earnestly grafting, mangling a perfectly innocent whip of apple stock exactly the way her sheets warned against. And she watched him for a while from the gate, this frightened, thawing, trying man who had kept her hours all summer, and then she came and took the knife out of his hand, the way you take scissors from a child, and finished the graft herself in 4 strokes, and bound it, and said, looking at the tree and not at him, that the account came out in his favour, narrowly, and that she was minded to carry the balance forward rather than close it. And he understood her, for he had learned her language at last, and that is all either of them ever said about it, and they walked back up to the house together through their own orchard, and the great doors were opened to the both of them by the same footman who had bowed her out in October, and if his bow this time was somewhat marred by his face, no one reproved him for it. She sleeps at the Abbey now. The years have gone on as years do, and there is a daughter, Frances, who has her father's grey eyes and her mother's way of watching a room until it makes sense, and who is already at 6 on confidential terms with every gardener on the place, and Thomas is at school and signs his letters "Your affectionate nephew," which neither of them corrects, and old Hartley lived to see it all settled, and died in his chair by the fire in the spring, with his daughter's hand in his, a steward's death, everything in order. And the fan lies on the Duke's desk to this day, bronze silk gone soft with years, and new maids are told never to move it, and are never told why. But the county knows why, and tells the story still, at its suppers and its christenings 30 years on, how the Duke of Wrexham sent his wife for a fan and she brought it, and her cloak with it, and how it took him half a year of winter and a 9-year-old's arithmetic to learn what he had sent across that ballroom, and how these days, at every assembly in that county, you may set your watch by it, before the first set forms. Whatever the company, however great the guest, the Duke of Wrexham crosses the whole width of any room there is, himself unasked, no footman in England fast enough to forestall him, and brings his wife her fan and puts it into her hand and waits until she smiles, and the footmen stand easy while he does it. All 11 of them, for that errand, in that family, is no longer staff work. It is the office of the master of the house, and it is never ever delegated.